Hey everybody, Chris Armiger, Fort Myers Beach. So for Module 7, I chose the Great White Shark Attack of 1916 in New Jersey to talk about for my case study. So the reason why I picked this one is because I live down in Southwest Florida. I'm on the Gulf Coast, so I have a lot of experience, being out on the water, fishing and stuff like that with sharks. Not necessarily great whites, but sharks. Um, and I do some diving down in the Keys and a little bit on the Atlantic side, and have interaction with them there. So it was interesting to me because of that. And the other component was, so for a lot of this emergency management, stuff that we've been doing the last couple of years, it's a lot of weather, or rather natural incidents, and then we talk about the man-made incidents, terrorism and bombings and stuff like that. But this having to do with an animal that we encounter in our environment, it was just a little bit different to me. So I was interested in that. I was also very interested in the lion attack case study, but ultimately just because I live in Florida and I dive with these animals, it just piqued my interest. So I wanted to talk about this one. So to the beginning of the study in terms of emergency management, it's a great study because it talks about resources, and it mentions specifically the verbiage in the textbook. It uses the word finite. So you're the commander of a Coast Guard station, and you have this whole territory, this jurisdiction that you're responsible for. And it says, that you're not at wartime, but you're responsible to engage or start operating as if you were in wartime at any moment because of stuff, things going on politically. And then the other part of your responsibility is lifeguard duty, safety for beachgoers and stuff like this up in the Jersey Shore. So that's a very realistic thing that we deal with, 100 years later, and will probably deal with 100 years from now, is, resource management, finite resources. You have a variety of responsibilities, and you need to delegate your resources, your human capital. You need to delegate that, spend that capital in a way to maximize its efficiency and efforts, and try to achieve as much of your mission as you can. So for this case study, it says one of the biggest issues when you go through the different stages of the disaster, in the text it goes through 8 different stages, but essentially over about I think it was about a week, 10-day period, 12-day period, there were 4 people killed by what they suspect were a shark or sharks in a river basin, an upper river off the Atlantic shore. So they say communication is a big issue, that people weren't warned early enough that there was a life threat in the rivers that they're swimming in the summertime to get away from the heat and stuff like that. And had they had that warning, that perhaps they wouldn't have put themselves at risk by swimming in the river after the first attack. This is one thing that I find kind of unlikely. I lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and I lived until I was about 12 years old. And we lived in a place called Middle River in Essex. It's right off the Chesapeake Bay. And, it's about a 20-minute boat ride out to the Chesapeake, what you would think of the Chesapeake if you think about stuff you see on TV and stuff, from where we used to live. And we would swim in that creek all summer long, all the time, because it was hot. Back even in, when I was a kid in the 80s, there weren't a lot of in-ground pools up there. There were some above-ground pools, which we had eventually, but we used to just jump off the pier and swim in the creek all the time. So even if we thought that there was a threat, realistically we would have likely ignored the threat because, if a shark attack happened yesterday and one's never happened before, what's the likelihood of another one happening tomorrow? So it's really easy to dismiss things like that. And even being a diver today is, I go down to the Keys and I'll dive during mini season, and every once in a while you'll run into sharks, and most of them are benign and nothing to really worry about. I've seen one bull shark in all my time diving, and I still get in the water because I just, that's one. I don't think I'll really see another anytime soon. And if I do, I avoid it and I get out of their territory and I move on. But that's an interesting point that I wanted to bring up about this case study is, where I live now, we have the Caloosahatchee River, off the Gulf, and that runs all the way to Lake O and then back out on the Atlantic side. And if you follow anything with red tide, then you know all about it. But we have a lot of creeks, like Henry Creek is a smaller creek, Murlock Creek is a smaller creek. They're freshwater creeks. And at the end of this case study, what you find out is it's probably not a great white that was ever really involved in this, but they suspect bull sharks because they swim in freshwater. And where I live, we have saltwater from the Gulf, we have freshwater from Lake O, and specifically, directly where I live, we have brackish water, which is the combination of the mix of both. So we could have a white shark. It's unlikely, but we could. But we could certainly, and most likely do have bull sharks all around us where we're at now. And I can tell you that people swim in our creeks and in our rivers and our bays all the time, but we've never had an attack. So I don't think that having an attack has anything to do with mitigation that the Coast Guard performs at all. So when I think about this case study and try to make it today, if I was an emergency manager here in Lee County today, what would I do? First of all, if I was presented with this, and then secondly, if I was the guy tomorrow, what would I do? And of course, I have to worry about a bunch of things. Red tide is one, but all the other generic emergency management duties that you would consider for living on the Gulf Coast. So hurricanes, tornadoes, storm surge, evacuations. We have an influx of population, in the last 20 years has really boomed. It's doubling, tripling, quadrupling in size every 5-10 years. It's really, the population growth is insane. So you're updating EM plans further than you can really finish them. By the time you finish a sequence of plans for 1 to 3 years, you can't really sit back and coast and then watch them evolve over a 10-year period. You got to immediately jump right back into it because of the demands of the population. And that really has to do with resource management, and evacuation is the biggest part. And the other part of that is considering, building in the environment and meeting with builders and permitting departments and civil engineering agencies to plan out, hey, we don't want to build in a 100-year floodplain and blah, 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 and all those sort of things that we've discussed in previous chapters. But to bring it back to this, being an emergency manager, a situation like this, shark attacks, is something that you should consider and should plan for. So I would certainly say that I would, following the case study and the outcomes of the study, absolutely generate a response plan for a situation like this, a mitigation plan for a situation like this, and see what resources you have. There's a very interesting thing. We have a marine research lab here at Moss Marina. In that research lab, they have a neat app you can go onto your phone and you can download. I think it's called Shark Tracker. And Moss Marina, what they do is they've tagged literally hundreds of sharks. And they have the GPS tags. And you can go on your app and you can watch where these sharks are. You can find where they are at any time. And like I said, there's hundreds of them. And you can watch their migration, their feeding patterns, where they go. And so the point is, I think that it's fair to assume that if you have one of these sharks that are tagged, these larger sharks that this marina tags and generates a history for marine biology, if you have one big guy or 2 or 3 big guys, and most of them are female sharks, but if you've got 1 or 2 of them within a couple 100 miles of where you are, that would be the time to start really reviewing and looking at these plans and maybe even putting some stuff into action. This is some technological advantage that we have today that they didn't 100 years ago. One of the things from this case study said, a lot came from this case. One of the things that came from the case study was they learned a lot about sharks, about, that they recognized the need to start tracking or, learning about them, migrations, how to deal with situations like this. And I think that the technology that we have today helps really mitigate most of that, especially if you're using that sort of technology and you recognize that you have a female shark or several species of female sharks, those larger sharks that are in your area within a couple 100 miles. You can assume they're here to breed, which is going to breed other sharks, and that's going to be the point in time where they're most aggressive. So again, you'd want to adjust and maybe activate your plans according to that. The last thing that I want to mention, I'll just touch on it real quick because I'm getting a little long again, is and I've mentioned it in several other posts, is the financial impact. So one of the hesitations to close the beaches in Jersey 100 years ago was they relied on that summer season financially, and it would have been devastating to the community not to have that income for the summer. So even though this only lasted about 10, 12 days, the repercussions of it at least lasted the summer, if not a few seasons, until everything was worked out, until they started seeing those pictures in the newspapers of captured sharks and dead sharks, and all these fishermen bringing in all these big sharks, and we got the one, and stuff like that to help ease the minds of people there. The technology, the GPS sort of tracking thing, I think is another way today that would be different. They would know if they caught the big sharks or the ones that they suspected to be involved in the incident. They'd have a better understanding of like a reasonable time frame to maybe shut down waterways or make waterways less access to them for people, maybe not shut down fishing, but shut down public swimming and stuff like that in waterways where they could identify them. So anyway, I look forward to reading or listening and watching everybody else's posts. Thanks for investing the 11 minutes into mine, and I hope you have a great evening. See you. Bye-bye.